Our next speaker is Travis Olson, who is a Ph.D. candidate in art history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Travis Olson is interested in cultural history, material culture, and the built environment, with a specialization in American vernacular landscapes. He has published 2 e-monographs with Anna Andrzejewski, Perspectives on Place, North Dakota Field School, and Folk Farmsteads on the Frontier, North Dakota Field School. His graduate research focuses on the intersection of architectural and environmental history as it pertains to health resort culture. The title of his presentation is Making It on the Edge of the American West: The Prospective Landscapes of German-Russian Settlers in Southwestern North Dakota.
Hello, my name is Travis Olson. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Art History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, working under Dr. Andrew Jeske. And what I'm going to do today is be sharing some of my research, the driving idea behind my dissertation, which is on immigrant housing in Southwestern North Dakota. My paper today is titled Making It on the Edge of the American West: The Prospective Landscapes of German-Russian Settlers in Southwestern North Dakota. I want to start off today by providing a little geographical context, because I realized while interacting with some of the people present at the symposium and after listening to some of the other talks that we may not all listening to some of the other talks that we may not all be familiar with North Dakota, with the state. And because a general understanding of the state's geography is fairly important for my argument, I thought I'd take a minute or two just to provide a basic overview to orient us. So what you're looking at here on the screen is a satellite map of the state of North Dakota, which is the least visited of the contiguous United States. Its capital city, Bismarck, is located in the south central part of the state, and the Missouri River runs more or less defining the southwestern region where my research is focused. The most populous city in southwestern North Dakota is Dickinson, which has about 25,000 residents today. And to be more specific, my research is focused on parts of Stark and Hettinger County, which are located here. Most important to my talk today, and what I'm referring to in the title, The Edge of the West, is that this area is the transition from the arable lands of the eastern United States to the semi-arid lands of the American West, which is somewhat visible even in the satellite image in the gradient shift from the greens to the browns from east to west. This distinction was first noted by geologist John Wesley Powell following his 1869 geographic expedition for the U.S. Geological Survey, and published in a report prepared for the Secretary of the Interior, in which he described a line that roughly follows the 100th meridian, which he called the line of semi-aridity, or the 20-inch or 51-centimeter annual rainfall line. And what you see here on the screen is a map he prepared years later in an attempt to persuade the federal government to bear in mind the West's aridity in their plans pertaining to settlement. You can see that this line essentially bisects North Dakota with a slight curve that reflects the flow of the Missouri River. And this image shows stitched together from 1957 aerial photographs that are stitched to help illustrate what this meant on the ground. This is the southwestern corner of Stark County, and hopefully you can see just in this 15-mile stretch how the landscape shifts from primarily crop agriculture, which is identifiable by the striped pattern on the land to the east, to pasture land or ranch country to the west. This is a very particular landscape, one that's difficult to farm. And as I will argue, one of the main reasons why the state and federal governments advertised heavily for immigration from the Eurasian steppes. And one last note, please forgive this illustration. It's simply a screenshot of my working map, and it shows too much information for our purposes today. But these dots correspond to the farmsteads of Stark County in 1914, which is based off of a period atlas. The different colors show the ethnicities of the families living on the farms. This is information drawn from census data and church records and family histories. So the green dots on this map are German Russians, most of whom emigrated from villages in the Beresan enclave, both Catholic and Lutheran villages, but more so in Stark County, more so Catholics. The orange dots are German Hungarians, urbanators, and the magenta pink dots are Czech families, most of whom are Bohemians who came to America from Crimea. So this county, Stark County, was largely settled from east to west, and you can maybe see how the different communities settled in a more or less north to south pattern. German Russians met land agents in the railroad towns at Antelope and Richardson, Bernarders in Gladstone, and then settlement patterns become less starkly defined as many different groups visited land offices in the county's largest town, Dickinson. Today, I'll be focusing on this area here, which is the St. Pius community around the village of Sheffield, a name that was anglicized from Schoenfeld. So in May of 1898, Jacob and Attilia Hecker and their 7 children left their village of Regwa near the Munition colony in what was then South Russia, near modern-day Hradovka, Ukraine, for a new life of greater opportunity on the American Great Plains. The Heckers were just one of hundreds of families that immigrated to southwestern North Dakota from the Eurasian steppe between 1889 and 1911. These are groups of people who are not only enticed by the availability of cheap lands, but who are actively courted by agents working for the Northern Pacific Railroad and the Dakota Territory's Bureau of Immigration, which was initially housed in the Department of Agriculture and Labor. Coming to Dickinson in late summer, and not atypical of new arrivals, they bought a house in town while they scoped out potential homesteads. This time allowed them to connect with kin and to meet other newly arrived German Russians in the area. They remained in Dickinson for about 4 years, during which time Jacob worked as a farmhand and day laborer to save the money necessary to start a homestead. When Jacob chose a site 13 miles south of town in 1903, it was only about 2 miles northeast of Michael and Mariana Frank, who had chose their plot about 4 years earlier. Their neighboring homesteads were purposefully orchestrated, as the eldest Frank's son married the eldest unmarried Hecker daughter in 1904. After helping his father establish the farm, Jacob's son Nicodemus took up a homestead of his own about a mile to the southeast. And you see that here in orange. And then in 1909, he married Ava Frank. And shortly thereafter, he purchased land from the railroad and moved to a new property adjacent to his in laws. There, he built a house and a barn of local stone, likely quarried at one of the rocky outcroppings common in the area. The Nick and Ava Hecker farm, or rather the Hecker Sticka Dukert Freeman farm's buildings, are quite simple, even by the standards of immigrant building in the area. So much so that the major architectural surveys of Stark County have largely overlooked this property. The earliest of these surveys began in the early 1970s by priest and sociologist Father William Sherman, pastor of the St. Paul's Newman Center and lecturer in sociology at North Dakota State University, who became interested in the ethnic roots of the state. The second survey, led by Michael Koop, was overseen by the State Historic Preservation Office in the early 1990s, and it built on Father Sherman's work. And in many cases, it drew from what they saw as the finest examples of Father Bill's surveys around which to write this historic context report. And then the third survey was conducted by James Sexton for Tetra Tech in 2015-2016 as a Section 106 project for Next Era Energy, who were installing a wind farm, an energy farm in the area. And this is how I became involved in the project. So I imagine that the Hecker Sticker Dugert Freeman farm, and I'm using that long name for a reason that will become clear, has been largely overlooked because it doesn't clearly illustrate the ethnic building traditions that these earlier surveys were attempting to showcase. The historic context was looking to develop a typology, and so it chose the best examples from their classification. Chose the best examples to form their classification system. This house has a really large addition on the front facade and is comparatively late. It was built around 1920 by the American-born son of an immigrant, so it doesn't illustrate or demonstrate what Father Bill was really looking for. That was the direct transference of old world forms to the new. But it's for these reasons that I argue that the Hackesser Freeman Farm is a prime example of early 20th century German Russian architecture on the northern Great Plains. Because whereas these previous studies were largely focused on the Germanic roots of these building forms, my research focuses less on the process of ethnic acculturation and more on in terms of modernization to showcase how the people living on the edge of the West or the western extent of this arable land had to navigate American policies like the Public Land Act and the Homestead Act and systems of capitalism to realize not only the goals of these broader structures, but also the dreams that drove them to leave their homelands in the first place. So, acculturation or adaptation, whatever word you want to use to explain the process, is so often framed in reactionary terms. So, as a response to these outward pressures. But instead, the intent of my work is to rethink this process in terms of futurity or change as the evidence of striving to realize an imagined future. In the process, I challenge some of the assumptions we have developed about the frontier and about how the American middle class housing developed in the first half of the 20th century to argue that it's not sufficient to dismiss this evidence as either cultural peculiarity or some terms of heroic individualism. In a time period that was recognized for the proliferation of catalog plans and kit houses, and there are plenty of those in my study area. This research demonstrates how families took both products and ideas from magazines and catalogs and neighbors to make the concepts of convenience, comfort, and modern life espoused within those materials work for their family without foregoing the cultural markers of their community. To contextualize my argument, it's first necessary to provide you with a very brief summary of the conclusions that came from these earlier surveys of the area. So in 1974, Father Sherman's work was published in an essay called Prairie Architecture of the Russian German Settlers, which was published within and included as a sort of coda to the English translation of Richard Salad's German Russian settlements in the United States. At the close of this essay, he writes, the quote, any house to a certain extent is a monument to the family that erected it. The German Russian house stands as a shrine to its builders in a double sense. As a building, it reflects the special values of its makers agrarian, utilitarian, durable, earthy, and well adapted to both harsh and happy circumstances. In a wider sense, it is the history of its people written in large and permanent letters. The initial German heritage is present in its outlines and wooden structures. The many generations of Russian living are spelled out clearly in the materials and overall feeling. And today, the modifications brought about by first, second, and third generation American living are present, seen in the machine siding and dormers, and the porches which were added to adorn the exterior. While I don't disagree with the broader intention behind this prose, you can hear in this passage his dismissal of American influence as, quote, machine siding added to adorn the exterior. But this passage helps us understand what Father Bill was looking for in his survey, and because he was looking for it, he found it. At the end of his essay, he provides us with three generalized house plans, two of which are relevant to the argument at hand, which seem to come from, and this is the essay is sparsely cited, but they seem to come from both his own observations throughout North Dakota and from Schneer's 1967 Heimatbuch. Recognizing that there's always some degree of variation, he argues that while in Russia, the most common house form and sort of the pinnacle of German housing on the Eurasian steppe was 3 rooms wide and 2 rooms deep. The central rooms, you're seeing that in the lower left here. So the central rooms were the kitchens, which were understood something like a divided kitchen and scullery. And then the Staatsstube or stateroom, which was a parlor bedroom, and then sleeping spaces for the rest of the family. This house type, though present in North Dakota, wasn't as common, but was rather seemed to be what this community sort of aspired to. Instead, the characteristic form in North Dakota was a single pile version, so upper left, again with a central kitchen, uh, and then bedrooms flanked the central kitchen flanked by bedrooms, which he identified as the front and back room. The Vorhausel, which is an enclosed vestibule entryway, was useful for keeping dust and snow from blowing directly into the house. This this element was ubiquitous on the plains, and Father Bill argues that this was one of the elements that Germans adopted from Russian building practices. The second survey, the early 1990s survey, resulted in a historic context report for the North Dakota Preservation Office. And because of that, they developed a broader typology to identify key features of German Russian houses that may not cleanly fall within one of these two forms. However, they did conclude just as the Stark County ethnic settlers utilized a limited number of materials to construct their houses, they also relied on only a few basic floor plans to design their dwellings. The primary difference between the Old World house plans and those in Stark County is that the North Dakota builders seem to have been more conservative in the scale of their houses. Nearly all appeared to have originally been constructed as single pile buildings, resulting in fewer interior rooms. And again, to illustrate that point, most of the German Russian houses that they surveyed and recorded were 3-bay single pile homes, so 3 rooms wide, 1 room deep. However, they did include in the report 3, quote, anomalies where early additions disrupted the German Russian traditions. My point of departure is that these anomalies and others like them are far more prevalent than, and more importantly, better representative of the area's building traditions. And to borrow from Father Bill's poetry, the history of their people written in large and permanent letters. While the focus of this paper is the architectural evidence of the German Russian settlers, the larger argument here is that this ethnic group is distinct from other settlers in southwestern North Dakota because they sought a certain level of autonomy, similar to the type of closed colony that they and their ancestors had established on the Russian steppes. To set this up, I need to establish a very brief history of how the German Russians came to this part of North Dakota, what they were looking for, and what their vision was for their future. So, in other words, what they were working towards. As I mentioned at the very top of this talk, German Russians were courted by land agents working for the American railroad companies, who prepared pamphlets advertising cheap lands available on the Great Plains, and also cheap fares aboard their rail line to transport settlers from Atlantic seaports out to the Dakota Territory. According to Richard Seilet, these publications, these pamphlets first started to appear in German villages in South Russia in the 1870s. Also, the Dakota Territorial, and then after 1889, the state governments sought to entice immigration as well. And it's very telling that the state's immigration bureau was initially organized within the Department of Agriculture and Labor, because both the railroad companies and the government sought permanent settlers to both recoup and justify the expense of the rail lines to populate the plains. If the railroads were established to bring agricultural products to eastern markets, foremost being cereal crops like wheat, then they needed farmers to put the land to crop agriculture. And this was no easy task because of the dense root systems of prairie grasses and the semi-arid climate of western North Dakota. Many of the earliest settlers to the area had failed at this endeavor and moved on, and those who remained ranched sheep, then cattle, which grazed the prairie grasslands. The Germans on the Russian steppes, though, were ideally suited for the task, because not only were they known for their agricultural acumen, but their experience in Russia could directly translate to the Dakota landscape. So just as the Russian Empire had enticed them to the steppes, the American government sought to bring them to the plains. And we heard this multiple times in the symposium, so I won't spend too much time repeating, but I will instead add some of the American context to this conversation. At the same time, many German Russian families were looking for new opportunities as Russia began retracting many of the privileges that they had been granted to entice them to settle in Russia in the first place. But really, it seems the main factor for leaving was that they needed more land to sustain their ever growing families, to be able to set up sons on farms of their own. And so, as this opportunity presented itself, villages began sending scouting troops, Kundschafter, to America. They were looking to find somewhere not too dissimilar from home, where there were lots of available land and where they could establish new villages and continue their way of life. In North Dakota, they found suitable land, but the structures of American policy, like the preemption law and the Homestead Act, that both require 160-acre claims, didn't allow for the creation of rural villages in the same way. Further, the 46 million acre 40-mile wide swath of land the US government had in 1864 granted the Northern Pacific Railroad to fund its completion had essentially created a checkerboard on the landscape with alternating sections of claimable federal land and land available for purchase through the railroad company. So I'll take a minute just to look at what that means. So this is the state of North Dakota, and here this line represents the route of the Northern Pacific Line, which connects all of these cities in the southern half of the state. The U.S. government had given the railroad company, through this land grant, 40 miles of land on either side of the line, organized in 20 odd number sections extending in either direction. This created a checkerboard pattern on the landscape, and we can zoom in to this study area on the map to see this more clearly. But you can see how the shaded areas are the section included in the railroad land grant. So the shaded elements are railroad land, and then the unshaded are federal land or government land. We can visualize this a little better if we color it in the claim sections. So the orange here are all of those farmsteads that were claimed in 1895 when this map was made. All those farmsteads claimed through the Federal Homestead Act. And then in red are all the homesteads that are located on properties that had been purchased from the railroad company before 1895. While in Russia, German villages were, and this is very generally speaking, they were set up as what Carl Stumpf has called street villages, where families lived in houses lined up on either side of a road on more or less uniformly sized lots that was surrounded by farmland. To return to North Dakota and to my argument, we'll look at some of the German-Russian houses in the St. Pius community in southern Stark County. The green shaded areas here are federal homesteads, and the yellow, and the yellow are farmsteads on land purchased from the Northern Pacific Railroad Company. Hopefully this image is a work in progress, but hopefully you can sort of see how this community attempted to carry that sort of linear village form from Russia to North Dakota. But because of the specifications of the Homestead Act, this is enacted on a much larger spread out scale. Instead of small village lots, they're repeating this same sort of linear form on much larger 160-acre parcels. To demonstrate how the architecture of the German-Russian families in Stark County show the way that this group made real their vision for the future in their new homeland, we'll look at 5 houses built in the St. Pius community, named for the Catholic Church that formerly stood at its center. This church, St. Pius, was built in 1912 and closed in 1990 and was subsequently demolished. These 5 houses were built within 4 miles of each other, which on this exaggerated village scale makes them more or less next door neighbors. We begin with the Raymond and Margareta Frank farmhouse. This one is often held up as the quintessential surviving example of the form in the St. Pius community. You can plainly see the German-Russian tradition. It was built in 1906 by an immigrant family. Ray Frank was the son of Michael Frank and the brother-in-law of Nick Hecker, both from the introduction of this paper. The house is constructed of locally quarried stone, collected during clearing fields and from small quarry sites in the rocky outcroppings in the area. By American standards, this house and houses like it are incredibly overbuilt. This has 2-foot thick stone walls, plastered inside and out with a mixture of clay-rich soil that they refer to as gumbo, which is mixed with prairie grasses and or straw to hold it together and adhere it to the house. At first look, this seems to be the sort of typical German-Russian and North Dakota house form. Has 3 rooms, 1 room deep. One enters through that centrally placed forehousel into a kitchen, which is flanked by a room on either side. This house, though, was originally constructed of just 2 rooms, and very early in its history, a 3rd room was added, built onto the eastern end. But this addition was not to achieve the traditional plan, but this addition was a coal shed instead of living space. So even in this model example of the form, we can see evidence of the immigrant family taking advantage of American materials and technologies to construct a house that's more suitable to their new northern environment. While lumber was by no means plentiful on the northern plains, it was easily accessible through local markets. The Northern Pacific Railroad regularly carried lumber from the Pacific Northwest to lumber yards along its route through the plains and further east. In the warmer climates of the Eurasian steppes, keeping the house warm was not as dire of a concern as it was in the Dakota winter, which may explain why the Frank house departs from this traditional form in two significant ways. First, this coal shed was a necessity because coal storage had to be both easily accessible and substantial enough to last through the winter. Second, that coal fed two stoves, likely purchased from the catalogs, that shared a central chimney. The availability of lumber meant that the Franks could build a higher roof, a higher pitched roof, to make room for bedrooms upstairs. And it heated both of these rooms by heat emanating from that central chimney and through warm air rising through vents in the floors. So while this house is still recognizable to neighbors as a German Russian house, this building demonstrates how immigrants took advantage of local products to make their traditional forms more comfortable and efficient. As a final note on this house before moving on, I want to point out two other elements that you'll notice in all of the houses that we're looking at today. First, the houses in Stark County, almost as a rule, are oriented either to the south or to the east, effectively turning their backs to the cold, harsh northwesterly winds. Even in cases like this, where that also meant that the house turns its back to the road. And the house is located here. And the back of the house is right up against the road here. This seems to be to some degree a practice that was learned through trial and error in the Dakotas, as there are some farms in the area that contain multiple period homes. In cases where the first homes were oriented to either the north or the west, the second houses usually rectify this mistake. And there are others that have additions that reorient the facade. And we'll see examples of both of those today. The second element is this small window in the back. So, whenever possible, builders attempted to limit openings on the north and west sides of the house. But small windows like this one were both common and necessary in houses with that had this central kitchen. They were necessary to bring both light and ventilation to the main workspace of the house. Raymond Frank's younger brother, John, was born in 1884 and was 14 when the family came to North Dakota. So the Franks emigrated from the Landau colony in the Veresan district of Russia, sending first their eldest unmarried son, Stefan, as scout. While Ray was 13 years John Sr., he lived first in Dickinson working at a brickyard to save money to establish his homestead. But John first lived with his parents, Michael and Mariana, to establish the first Frank homestead in the area in 1899. In either 1906 or '07, John took up his own farmstead on the quarter section directly east of his brother Ray, expanding the family farm and building a one-room rock house. In 1908, he married Frances Hecker, who was a cousin of Nick Hecker, and the couple took up residence in this home and had four children that survived infancy. The house is in near ruin today, so there's little evidence to precisely date the two additions. But the first was a shed roof frame wing built onto the front of the house, extending to the south, which reoriented the building to face east. And you can see that the original one room house did not have any western facing windows. Reorienting the house like this would have meant protecting the family from being snowed in, as the wind caused drifts that could accumulate in front of and block the door. The second addition off the now rear of the house has two windows that were necessary to give some light and ventilation to the new room. But you can kind of see in this photograph that these windows are smaller and higher than the other windows in the house because they face the north and the west. John Frank died young in 1918 at the age of 34, and Frances remarried, moving off the farmstead. So this house wasn't further expanded. Located where it was, the Frank brothers purchased the property to keep the extended family farm intact. This one room house was a far cry from the six-room example cited as the common house form developed in Russia, and even from the three-room form detailed in the historic context report. The John Frank house was not cataloged in either study. However, one-room houses like this were somewhat common in the area, though this example is quite rare of a survival for the way that the original structure is clearly visible. Just as a point of comparison, the Joseph and Francisca Dukert house, which is a few miles to the north, also began as a one-room house, but because it was occupied for much longer, the house was expanded to the point where the original structure is really difficult to identify. Houses like these make up the speculative landscape of southwestern North Dakota as they illustrate this accumulation and homesteading process. John was in his early 20s when he staked his claim, and homesteading requirements meant that he had to build a house, he had to enclose and improve the land. But more than that, more than meeting requirements, survival depended upon breaking ground, planting seed, and building shelter. John's success, and by which I mean that he proved up in 1912 and that this claim is still owned by the Frank family today over a century later, this was largely due to his family connections, because John wasn't just starting a farm, but was expanding his family's land holdings, demonstrating why German Russian communities sought out large areas of available land, not just to establish family farms, but to establish community. Because John was expanding his family's land holdings, he made his first task building a house to fulfill the homesteading requirements. In many cases, the house was not the first structure built, nor was it the most significant. Nick Hecker proved his homestead in 1911, and around the same time purchased outright a half section about 2.5 miles east to set up a new farm. It seems likely that he had initially homesteaded to increase the size of his father's claim because he was 23 and a bachelor at the time, and he chose land on the other side of then what was then vacant Section 13, on which the two could graze their livestock. But after marrying Ava Frank, who's Ray and John's sister, in 1909, he decided to set up a farm of his own. And the house that Nick Hecker built, much like the Raymond Frank farmhouse, looks like a three-room plan. But again, that's not really the reality. The first house was built with 2 rooms, but it was built as a house and granary. Perhaps the most American thing about this landscape is that life depended upon commodifying the land and putting it into production. And because of this, there are many examples like the Hecker house where the granary was the first thought and often the first permanent building constructed. In some cases, newly arrived immigrants would build sod houses or dugouts to live in while they built the grain storage, and it's likely that the type of structure that Nick built on his first homestead. If there's one piece of architectural evidence that separates German Russians from the other groups immigrating from the Eurasian steppe, it is their large and very impressive granaries. Only 2 miles from the new farm, Nick and Ava were probably living on the original homestead while they constructed their granary house on this new property. And the promise of the American government was that the 160-acre plot could be theirs after 5 years if they improved it and put it into production. But that amount of acreage, proved not to be enough in Stark County, as was true of most of the American West, because 160 acres wasn't enough farmland to be profitable. Granaries like these proved to be necessary to store a portion of your harvest to sell in futures markets. And it was difficult. Nick and Ava had 2 sons, born in 1911, 1913, but they likely only lived here until 1917 or 18 because Nick sold the farm and the family moved out to California. Now, here's where the story gets a little complicated as I add in the last 2 families, but bear with me and I promise that I'll bring it all back together. So, about a mile to the east, John Warner was also constructing a 2-room house. He was born in Russia, but immigrated as an infant and was raised in Dakota about 40 miles northeast west of here on the edge of the Badlands. I'm not going to spend too much time in this house at the moment because it's essentially the same 2/2 form as Ray Frank's house was. But the notable exception is that the attic here is an unfinished loft that was only used seasonally for sleeping, unlike the Frank house, which was a permanent sort of bedroom situation. But I mention this house now to illustrate the mindset. So John Warner married Ottilia Sticker in 1902, and they initially claimed a homestead about 25 miles north of here to ranch the land, just as John's father had done. But they abandoned their claim in 1905 because the unclaimed lands that ranchers depended upon to graze their cattle was quickly being claimed by new homesteaders. So John and Ottilia moved south to land adjacent to Ottilia's father and two brothers' farms, both in the St. Pius community, thus expanding the Sticka family farm even further. By 1911, when John and Ottilia proved their claim, they had five sons, so seven were living in this two-room house. In 1910, instead of expanding the house, the Wanners bought more land adjacent to the property that had become available. They had six more kids by 1920, so that's now 13 in this house. And on the 1930 census, there were 16 living at home, but I believe this house was expanded by that time. All this is to say that, like so many, they forewent the comforts of home in the service of the crop. Clem Steyer's story is similar to John Wanner's. He was an orphan, he arrived in 1891, and he worked on a ranch about 10 miles south of here. By 1899, he had saved up enough money to strike out on his own. He purchased and he claimed this homestead in Stark County here seen in green. First, he built a sod house, which he lived in for 2 years, while he built a more permanent stone house that you see on your screen and a barn. But by 1906, all of the unclaimed land that he had depended upon to graze his cattle was quickly disappearing as families like the Franks and the Heckers and the Wanners moved in. So he sold off part of his herd and he purchased a section outright from the railroad to take up farming. He kept his original homestead property, expanded it, and continued to use the old barn, and he converted that old house, as we see on the screen, into a granary. Between 1915 and 1920, Nick Hecker had sold his farmstead. He took the proceeds, he moved west to California, and Ralph Sticka, the new owner, was John and Attilia Warner's nephew, and he was married to Ray and Maggie Frank's daughter. So, are you following the genealogy? It's a lot to be thrown at you, but the point that I'm trying to make is that there's a significant amount of movement happening in the area. It's a very active process to build this community and to keep all of this farmland in a family network. So they're working to build the village both by taking advantage of land patents and cheap railroad land, and through marriage and kinship networks. Here, I should mention that one of the largest differences between immigrating to Russia in the beginning of the 19th century and immigrating to America in the beginning of the 20th, to entice settlement, the Russian government had given each settler a land grant of 60 desatines, which was about 162 acres, so a very comparable parcel size. But in Russia, this grant did not mean ownership in the same way. While part of the allotment was assigned to the family in heredity, settlers in Russia would receive a village lot, a share of cropland, and access to a communal pasture. But the land itself remained crown land, and remained owned by the Russian state. In America, once you purchased or proved your homestead, it became real property which could be sold. When Ralph bought the farm, it was a starter home for him, but he did build a new house, so that his family didn't have to live in the granary like Nick Hecker's family had to. I'll just point out a few things about this building. Though Ralph was born in North Dakota, he's the first generation American to enter the story. His house is the first in my presentation here, the first included to be that idealized three-room plan. Also, have you noticed that while the original house and granary faced west, Ralph corrected this and he reoriented the house to face east. And again, we have diminished windows on the west and north side of the building. Ralph and Tilly only lived on the property for about 10 years before they leveraged it to buy a larger farm further south, selling it to Rudolf Dukert, who was Clem Steyer's son-in-law. So again, keeping it in that family network. These three farms each demonstrate the ways that these families transformed their traditional buildings and building practices into three quite different modern farmhouses. On the Hackesticker Dukert farm, Rudolf Dukert built a large wood frame addition to the front of the house, moving the kitchen out of the traditional central spot and carving out family space and private bedrooms. This move also worked to isolate the work area of the house from the leisure area without demoting the kitchen's primary position. The family still enters into the house, into the kitchen. It's still the house's most public room. On the Warner farm, John and Attilia, who now remember have 16 children at this point, expanded the two-room house by moving another house to the site and attaching it to the existing house's south side. So again, reorienting this house to the east. It seems likely that this house had originally belonged to Attilia's brother Ambrose, um, who had sold John the property and moved away in 1927. So he bought this property, bought the house, and moved it, connecting it to his. Though somewhat different in terms of the methods, the effect is similar. The creation of communal family space and more private sleeping rooms that are separated from the kitchen working space. So here, by attaching these two separate houses, the new wing becomes further removed from the kitchen, which allows that kitchen to expand into that two-part kitchen and scullery form. Clement Barbara Steyer's house shows the transformation probably most profoundly because the two outright abandoned the original two-room house to build a new one on this larger plot of land. Perhaps inspired by the American tea plan cottages that they would have seen in the railroad cities of Dickinson and New England, or by the homes advertised in their catalogs, and I would argue with a real arts and crafts inspired sensibility. This house looks very fashionable and modern without completely sacrificing cultural traditions. According to family history, Clem took apart his stone corrals on the old ranch and moved that rock to the new site. He harvested clay gumbo to stack the stones together to build these 2-foot thick walls. The floor plan is also very different from American houses of the period. You enter into these liminal spaces, the porches, the vestibules, but whereas Yankee houses of the period opened into public rooms, sort of showy leisure spaces, the Steyer's home still enters into the kitchen. So rather than diminishing the kitchen size and hiding it in the back, as in the Yankee examples on the left, it retains the primary spot in the plan. However, they did separate the traditional Staatsstube into 2 rooms. And so you see that on the right with the red and orange. So a living room and then a devoted primary parents' bedroom. So you can see this separation of public and private, but to Yankees, the public means leisure space, and relaxation in Yankee houses, whereas it means gathering and food preparation and labor for the German Russians. While these 3 houses show different ways that these families transformed the traditional buildings into modern farmhouses, they took separate approaches to similar effect, distinguishing the function of rooms, designating family leisure space, and increasing privacy in sleeping spaces. You can see this even further when you look at the organization of farmsteads and the separation of farm and domestic buildings. To say nothing of pulling the house out of the granary, like the Hecker farm. Here we're looking at the Steyer farm. The barn and house, the original barn and house are quite close together when compared to their second property. This separation ensured that the livestock was kept further from the house, away from the kitchen garden, and away from the house as well to avoid contamination. So to conclude, my research is working towards working to move beyond the framework of acculturation or reacting to the pressure of outside forces, and perhaps towards a framework of accumulation or speculation. The 2 surveys I began this essay with were both framed in terms of acculturation, and they didn't include any of these houses, the Hackasticka Dukert Freeman farm, the Wannersticka farm, or John Frank's house, or either of Clem Steyer's farms, because they had all lost some imagined authenticity or failed to demonstrate the exaggerated idea of the German-Russian farmhouse in North Dakota. I argue rather that these farms perhaps better represent this ethnic group because they all demonstrate ways and the accumulation of experiences earned in their attempt to build a cultural community. And this accumulation is evident in a much more significant way than what Father Bill called machine siding added to adorn the exterior, but rather shows the methods of a group of people taking individual actions to help build a community and to achieve a unified future. So not reacting to American culture, but shaping it. Thank you.